The Duke did not look at her once during the wedding ceremony, not when she walked down the aisle, trembling under the heavy silk of her mother's gown, not when the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife. He simply took her hand with the indifference of a man completing a business transaction, and Alara Vane, now her Grace the Duchess of Thornwood, felt the first crack splinter through her heart. The wedding breakfast was worse. Thornwood Hall glittered with candles and white roses, but the guests barely met her eyes. They whispered behind gloved hands, their curiosity sharp and pitiless. Alara sat beside her new husband at the long table, her plate untouched. The Duke, Lord Aldrich Ashworth, spoke to everyone except her. When Lord Henshaw offered a toast to the happy couple, Aldrich raised his glass without turning his head. His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the silence like a blade. Let us not pretend sentiment where there is none. This union settles a debt, nothing more. Alara's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had married to save her family's estate, to protect her ailing father from ruin, and she had known the Duke of Thornwood did not love her. But she had foolishly hoped for kindness. The hope died in that cold, glittering room, under the weight of 100 staring eyes. The days that followed were a slow, quiet starvation. Aldrich provided her with everything a duchess could require: fine gowns, a private sitting room, a lady's maid who was more jailer than companion. But he offered nothing of himself. He took his meals in his study. He slept in a separate chamber. When they passed each other in the corridors, he inclined his head as if she were a distant acquaintance, and his dark eyes passed over her with a blankness that made her feel invisible. Alara tried. She rose early each morning and arranged fresh flowers in the great hall. She asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, about his preferences and had his favorite dishes prepared. She left small notes in his study, gentle words wishing him a peaceful day. Each note vanished, but he never mentioned them. One evening she gathered her courage and knocked on his study door. He opened it a fraction, his face hard and unreadable. "Is there something you require, Your Grace?" His tone was formal, distant, a wall of ice. "I thought we might take tea together," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know so little of you." His jaw tightened. "You know all that is necessary. We are married. That is the extent of our connection." He closed the door. Alara stood in the corridor, the echo of the latch clicking into place louder than any shout. She walked back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and felt the fragile hope inside her wither and curl up like a fallen leaf. The first public humiliation came 2 weeks later. A small dinner party had been arranged by Aldrich's cousin, Lady Margaret Ashford, a beautiful, sharp-tongued woman who had never hidden her displeasure at the marriage. Lady Margaret had wanted the Duke for herself, and everyone knew it. She presided over the table with the easy confidence of a woman who believed the Duchess was merely a temporary inconvenience. Alara wore a gown of pale lavender, her hair dressed simply. She sat at the far end of the table while Lady Margaret sat at Aldrich's right, laughing at his rare remarks, her hand sometimes brushing his sleeve. Alara tried to join the conversation, speaking of the estate garden she had begun to restore, but Lady Margaret's smile sharpened. "How charming," Margaret said, "that you find occupation in the soil. The previous Duchess, Aldrich's dear mother, was known for her patronage of the arts, but I suppose gardening suits a country upbringing." A few guests tittered. Alara's cheeks burned. She looked toward Aldrich, hopping for even the smallest defense. He was cutting his meat, his expression utterly unmoved. He said nothing. The silence was a second wound, deeper than the first. After dinner, Alara excused herself and walked alone into the moonlit garden. She stood by the old stone fountain, staring into the dark water. She had never felt so completely alone. The grand house loomed behind her, filled with people, and yet she was nothing but a ghost. In the weeks that followed, she stopped trying. She no longer left notes. She no longer arranged flowers in his study. She took her meals in her sitting room. The house staff noticed the change. Mrs. Finch's gaze grew softer, sadder, but Alara could not bear pity. She threw herself into the one corner of Thornwood that asked nothing of her, the neglected library. Dust motes danced in shafts of pale winter light, and she spent hours reading, losing herself in worlds far kinder than her own. It was in the library that she met Mr. Julian Ashcroft. He was the estate's steward, a man of quiet intelligence and steady presence, with warm brown eyes and a voice that never hurried. He had come to retrieve a ledger from the shelves and found her tucked into a window seat, a volume of poetry resting in her lap. He bowed with genuine respect, not the cold formality she had grown used to. "Your Grace, I apologize for intruding." "You are not intruding," she said, and was surprised to mean it. They talked that day about books, about the history of the estate, about the apple orchards beyond the South Meadow. Julian did not look through her. He listened. When she spoke, his attention was full and unhurried. It was the first real conversation she had experienced since her wedding day, and it felt like water after a long drought. Their meetings became a quiet, innocent habit. They walked the garden paths while she asked about the tenants. He showed her the old dovecote and the wild rose thicket near the river. Alara laughed for the first time in months when a sparrow swooped close and startled him. Julian smiled and said her laughter was a sound the estate had been missing. Aldrich noticed. It happened on a gray afternoon when the mist clung to the hills. Alara had taken a basket of bread and preserves to a tenant family with a newborn child, and Julian had accompanied her to help navigate the muddy lanes. They returned through the west gate, their voices light with shared purpose. Aldrich was standing at the window of the upper gallery, his figure half hidden by the heavy curtain. He watched his wife walk beside another man. He saw her smile, the easy tilt of her head, the way Julian leaned slightly toward her as if drawn by an invisible thread. Something twisted in the Duke's chest, hot and unfamiliar. He turned away before she could glance up. That evening, Aldrich appeared at dinner for the first time in weeks. Alara looked up from her soup, startled. He sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled stillness. The meal passed in heavy silence. Finally, he spoke. "You spent the afternoon with my steward." It was not a question. Alara set down her spoon. "I visited the Coulter family. Their baby is unwell. Mr. Ashcroft was kind enough to escort me." "Kind," Aldrich repeated, the word clipped and cold. "You will not seek his company again." The unfairness of it struck her like a slap. "I have done nothing improper. He has shown me common decency, which is more than I receive in this house." His eyes flashed. "You are the Duchess of Thornwood. Your reputation is mine. I will not have whispers." Alara rose from her chair, her hands trembling. "There would be no whispers if you ever treated me as a wife instead of a debt you regret." Her voice cracked on the last word. She did not wait for his reply. She left the dining room and did not look back. That night she wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the dreams she had once carried of a marriage built on quiet affection. She wept because despite everything, her heart still lurched when Aldrich entered a room, and that pathetic hope was the cruelest prison of all. She resolved to lock it away, to become as distant as he was. If he wanted a transaction, she would give him one. She became a shadow. She performed her duties with impeccable grace, hosting tenants, luncheons, and attending church, but she no longer sought Aldrich's gaze. She no longer lingered in the corridor hoping to encounter him. Her silence was not defiance, it was survival. Lady Margate, sensing the fracture, pressed her advantage. At a county assembly she clung to Aldrich's arm and whispered intimately in his ear within full view of the gentry. Alara stood nearby, a fixed smile on her face, while the matrons exchanged knowing glances. When a kindly older lady asked if she was well, Alara answered, "Perfectly well, thank you," and felt another piece of herself turn to stone. Julian Ashcroft noticed the change in her. One day, finding her alone in the library, he said gently, "You seem faded, Your Grace. Forgive me, but you carry a weight no one should bear alone." Alara looked at him, at his earnest, open face. "I am learning to carry it," she said. "That is enough." He did not press, but his silent sympathy was a balm, and Aldrich saw that too. The Duke began to watch them with a sharp, guarded intensity. He found excuses to interrupt their conversations. He summoned Julian on trivial business, keeping him occupied far from the main house. The jealousy that Aldrich refused to name grew teeth. One afternoon, Elara entered the study to retrieve a book she had left there and found Aldrich staring into the fire, a small velvet box in his hand. He snapped it shut when he saw her, but not before she glimpsed its contents, a delicate silver locket. "What is that?" she asked, curiosity overriding her careful distance. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, his voice rough. She stepped closer. "It looked like a locket. Does it hold a portrait?" His expression shuddered. "A memory, leave it." The cold dismissal stung, but something deeper gnawed at her. A memory, a lost love, perhaps. The woman he could not have, the reason his heart was locked against her. The thought settled into her bones and festered there. She said nothing more, but the seed of a new pain took root. Weeks passed in heavy quiet. Elara's health began to fray. She lost weight. Dark smudges appeared beneath her eyes. Mrs. Finch fussed and sent up strengthening broths, but the true illness was loneliness, and no broth could cure that. One rainy night, a fever took hold. Elara shivered in her bed, her mind drifting through fevered dreams of falling snow and a deep, rushing river. She did not know that Aldrich entered her chamber. She did not feel him press a cool cloth to her forehead. She did not hear him dismiss the maid and sit beside her through the long hours before dawn. He watched her troubled sleep, and a strange, painful emotion cracked through his carefully built armor. He remembered the day he had saved a child from the river near his boyhood home, a little girl with wide gray eyes, the same gray as the storm clouds gathering outside. He had never known her name. He had drawn her face from memory and kept the sketch in a locket for years. A talisman of the one good thing he had done in a life darkened by his father's ruin and death. When Elara's fever broke, she opened her eyes to an empty chair pulled close to her bed. A glass of water stood on the nightstand, and a single white rose lay on the blanket. She stared at the rose, confusion and fragile hope warring in her chest. But by the time she was strong enough to leave her room, Aldrich had retreated again behind his wall of ice, and she dismissed the rose as a servant's kindness. The emotional breaking point arrived with the discovery of a letter. Elara, searching for sealing wax in Aldrich's desk while he was away on estate business, found a hidden drawer. Inside lay the velvet box with the locket, and beneath it, a folded, yellowed paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was dated years before, addressed to Aldrich's father, and it accused Baron Vane, her own father, of conspiring with rivals to destroy the Ashworth shipping venture. The signature was that of Aldrich's trusted solicitor, Mr. Hargrove. The words were damning. Her father had been branded a traitor, and she had been married as reparation. She read it 3 times. The room tilted. This was the reason for his coldness. This was why he looked at her as if she were a thief wearing stolen jewels. Her entire marriage had been built on a lie someone had told, and a lie Aldrich had believed without question. When Aldrich returned that evening, she was waiting in the study, the letter in her hand. Her face was pale but composed. She did not raise her voice. "Is this why you married me? Revenge for a crime my father never committed?" He froze, his eyes went to the paper, then to her face. The mask he wore cracked just slightly. "Where did you find that?" "You left it hidden," she said, her voice trembling now. "You married me to punish my family. You never intended to be a husband. You wanted a prisoner." He took a step toward her. "Elara." "No," she held up a hand. "I have spent months trying to earn what was never offered. I have been humiliated, ignored, belittled, and I bore it because I believed if I were patient enough, if I were good enough, you might one day see me. But you only ever saw my name." His throat moved. "The letter, I believed it was truth." "You believed it because you wanted to hate someone," she whispered, "and I was convenient." She turned and walked out of the study. He did not follow. She climbed the stairs to her room, packed a small valise, and sat down to write a letter of her own. She wrote of her father's honor, of her innocence, and of her decision to return to what remained of her family's estate. She would not beg. She would not stay where love had never existed. But before she could leave, the truth began its own journey toward the light. Aldrich, shaken by her words, rode to the solicitor's office that very night. He tore through old files, through Hargrove's private journals, and there he found it, a confession written in a shaky hand, revealing that the letter had been forged. Hargrove had embezzled funds from the Ashworth accounts and deflected blame onto Baron Vane to cover his tracks. The Baron was innocent. The marriage had been built on a deception that had destroyed 2 lives. Aldrich read the confession with numb horror. The guilt that crashed over him was absolute. He thought of Alara's quiet dignity, her gentle attempts to reach him, the way her light had slowly dimmed under his cruelty. He thought of the locket in his desk, the girl with gray eyes he had saved so long ago, and he suddenly remembered her name. She had told him, a child's frightened whisper, Alara. The memory slammed into him with the force of a flood. The girl he had carried from the river, the face he had cherished in secret for years, was the very woman he had treated as an enemy. He rode back to Thornwood as dawn broke, his horse lathered and spent. He burst into the great hall and found Mrs. Finch wringing her hands. The Duchess, she said, had ordered a carriage. She was leaving at any moment. Aldrich ran. He reached the front courtyard just as Alara descended the steps, her valise in hand. The carriage waited, the driver already holding the door. She was pale, her eyes red but dry. She looked at him once and then turned away. Alara, please. His voice broke on her name. Don't go. She stopped but did not face him. I will not stay where I am a reminder of a false sin. He crossed the gravel, his boots loud in the morning silence, and he did what the proud Duke of Thornwood had never done in his life. He dropped to his knees. She turned, her eyes widening in shock. It was forged, he said, the words raw and urgent. The letter was forged. Your father was innocent. I have been wrong. I have been blind and cruel and wrong, and I have wounded the one person who deserved only my protection. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He reached into his coat and drew out the velvet box. He opened it and held up the locket. Open it, he whispered. With trembling fingers, she took it and pressed the tiny clasp. Inside was a miniature, delicately painted, a young girl with gray eyes, her dark hair wet and tangled. The resemblance to her younger self was unmistakable. She stared at it, and a forgotten memory surged up from deep waters. A cold river, strong arms pulling her to safety, a boy's voice telling her she was safe now. Her hand flew to her mouth. It was you, that day at the river. I never knew your name, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I drew that from memory and carried it for years. You were the only good memory I had. And when I married you, I was so consumed by hate that I did not recognize the very face I had treasured. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She sank to her knees before him, the locket clutched against her heart. All this time, you thought I was the daughter of your enemy, and I thought you could never love me. He cupped her face with a gentleness that undid her. I have loved you since before I knew your name. I buried it under duty and rage and fear. I nearly lost you because of my pride. I have nothing to offer you but my regret, my truth, and a heart that has finally learned its lesson. Alara looked into his dark eyes, and she saw it at last, the deep, aching vulnerability of a man who had been as lonely as she was. The journey here had been a desert of pain, but the oasis was real and trembling before her. I will stay, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but not as a transaction, not as a debt repaid. I will only stay if you promise to let me in, completely. A shuddering breath left him. I promise. I will spend every day earning what you already gave freely. He helped her rise. The driver discreetly retreated. They stood in the gray morning light, the great house behind them, and for the first time, Aldrich did not turn away. He drew her gently into his arms and held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because she was, and he had almost thrown her away. The healing took time. There were days of quiet conversation in the library, of long walks where he told her of his father's death and the guilt that had corroded him. She told him of her own loneliness, her fear that she would never be enough. They learned each other slowly, honestly. The locket hung on a chain around her neck, a symbol of a bond that had been waiting to be remembered. A month later, Aldrich hosted a grand ball at Thornwood Hall, not out of obligation, but to publicly honor his wife. The same guests who had witnessed her humiliation now watched the Duke lead Alara to the center of the ballroom. He did not let go of her hand. Before the assembled crowd, he raised his glass. "To my wife," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Not for duty, not for debt, but for the courage she showed when I gave her nothing and the heart she kept open when mine was sealed shut. She is the grace I did not deserve." The room erupted in applause. Lady Margit stood frozen, her smile brittle and forced, but Alara did not spare her a glance. She looked only at her husband, and she saw in his eyes a warmth that had once seemed impossible. He pulled her into a waltz, and as they turned beneath the chandeliers, he leaned close. "I loved you too late," he murmured, "but I will love you long enough to make up for every lost day." She smiled, the first full, unburdened smile she had worn since her wedding day. "Then we have a great deal of time to fill." They danced until the candles burned low, and when the last guest departed, they walked together through the silent gardens. The fountain shimmered under the moon, and he stopped beside it, reaching into his pocket. "I have something else for you," he said, and placed a small key in her palm. "The key to every locked door in this house. No more hidden drawers, no more walls." She closed her fingers around it and looked up at him, her heart so full it ached. "We are truly starting over." "We are," he said, and kissed her forehead with a reverence that spoke of promises kept. "From this moment, Thornwood is your home, not your prison, and I am, finally, your husband." In the years that followed, the estate flourished. The apple orchards were restored, the tenant cottages repaired, and laughter returned to the corridors of Thornwood Hall. The Duke and Duchess were seen walking arm in arm through the village, and when their first child was born, a daughter with storm-gray eyes, Aldrich wept without shame. He named her Hope, because that was what Alara had given back to him. And every night, before they slept, Alara would touch the locket at her throat. And Aldrich would take her hand and press it to his heart. They never again spoke of debts or revenge. They spoke only of the quiet miracle that two broken, lonely souls had found each other in the darkness and built something unbreakable from the ruins. It was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real.